In the dying light of an ancient evening, as shadows stretch long across a landscape that has forgotten the names of its first children, imagine the sound of wind moving through grass that has grown over bones 300,000 years old, carrying with it the whispered secrets of how our ancestors found rest in a world that never truly slept. Picture, if you will, the flicker of firelight against cave walls where human hands once pressed themselves into immortality, where tired eyes closed for the final time, while others kept watch through the endless predator-filled darkness that was night before civilization tamed it with electric light and locked doors and the illusion of safety. What did it mean to sleep, when sleep itself was a gamble with death? When the act of closing one's eyes required a trust so profound that it bound communities together in ways we can barely comprehend in our age of solitary slumber and private bedrooms? How did our earliest ancestors navigate the landscape of dreams, when dreams themselves might have been their first glimpse into worlds beyond the immediate and tangible, when the boundary between waking and sleeping was not a simple transition, but a journey into realms where the spirits of animals danced with the memories of the dead, and the fears of the living took shape in shadows that moved with purpose through the caves of consciousness? Tonight, as you settle into your own carefully constructed sanctuary of rest, with your pillows arranged just so and your doors locked against a world that has largely forgotten what it means to be truly wild, consider the profound strangeness of sleep, as it was experienced by those who came before us, who faced each night not as a guaranteed return to morning, but as a passage through uncertainty where survival depended, not just on the strength of their shelters, but on the bonds of trust that allowed some to rest, while others remained vigilant against the sounds that moved in darkness beyond the reach of their fires. Before we begin this journey into the deepest mysteries of human rest, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from, and at what time of day you're joining us on this exploration of our ancestors' most vulnerable and essential hours. In the beginning, there was darkness, and in that darkness lived a terror so complete that sleep was not rest, but a form of temporary death that required resurrection each dawn. If dawn was fortunate enough to find you still breathing among the countless creatures that had already surrendered their breath to the patient hunger of night. Before fire became the first guardian of human vulnerability, before the dancing flames created the first circles of safety in an otherwise hostile world, our earliest ancestors faced each evening with the knowledge that consciousness was their primary weapon against extinction, that the act of remaining awake might be the thin line between seeing another sunrise and becoming sustenance for the nocturnal hunters that ruled the hours when human sight failed, and human strength seemed pitifully inadequate against claws and teeth evolved for darkness. Archaeological evidence from sites like Qasem Cave in Israel, where controlled use of fire dates back nearly 400,000 years, suggests that the mastery of flame represented not just a technological breakthrough, but a fundamental transformation in the rhythm of human existence, creating for the first time in our species' history the possibility of true rest, of sleep that was not constantly interrupted by the need to listen for the approach of death padding softly through the underbrush. The charcoal deposits and burned bone fragments scattered through these ancient layers tell a story of nights that were no longer surrendered to darkness, but claimed back from the wild through the simple yet revolutionary act of keeping fire alive when the sun died each evening in the western sky. Imagine, if you can, the first human who discovered that fire could be more than a tool for cooking or warmth, who realized that the dancing light could push back the boundaries of safety and create a space where eyes could close without the certainty of never opening again, where the vulnerable could find refuge, not just in the strength of their companions, but in the eternal vigilance of flame that never slept, never tired, never allowed its attention to wander from the circle of light that separated the human from the inhuman. This discovery would have been as profound as any religious revelation, as life-changing as the development of language itself, because it represented humanity's first victory over the tyranny of natural rhythms, the first assertion that human consciousness could reshape the basic conditions of existence. The evidence suggests that early firekeepers developed elaborate systems of rotating responsibility, with different members of the group taking turns maintaining the flames through the night, while others experienced what may have been the first truly deep sleep in human history, sleep that was no longer the light dozing of prey animals, but something approaching the profound unconsciousness that modern humans take for granted, each time they close their eyes in their secure bedrooms. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated, for it represents the moment when humanity began to assert dominance over the fundamental conditions of existence, when we stopped being merely another species that happened to walk upright, and began the long journey toward becoming the masters of our own survival. But even with fire as their guardian, these early humans faced challenges to their rest that we can barely comprehend, living as they did in a world where the distinction between dream and reality was far more fluid than it is for us, where the visions that came to them in sleep might be interpreted not as mere neural firing, but as visits from spirits, communications from the dead, or warnings from the landscape itself about dangers that lay ahead in their waking hours. The quality of their sleep would have been fundamentally different from ours, shaped not just by the physical conditions of their environment, but by a worldview in which the boundaries between the material and spiritual worlds were permeable, where closing one's eyes meant entering a realm that was just as real as the waking world, but governed by different rules, populated by different beings, fraught with different kinds of meaning. Recent studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies suggest that the introduction of artificial light fundamentally altered not just when humans sleep, but how they sleep, creating longer periods of uninterrupted unconsciousness, while simultaneously reducing the vividness and frequency of remembered dreams, leading some researchers to theorize that our fire-keeping ancestors may have experienced a form of consciousness during rest that was richer, more complex, and more integrated with their spiritual understanding of the world than anything accessible to modern humans, who have traded the uncertainty of flame-guarded sleep for the security of electric lighting and locked doors. The archaeological record preserves traces of this transformation in the form of sleeping areas arranged in careful proximity to hearths, in the positioning of tools and weapons within easy reach of resting bodies, in the evidence of communal sleeping arrangements that suggest trust and vulnerability shared equally among individuals who understood that survival depended not just on individual strength, but on collective vigilance maintained even in the depths of exhaustion. As we trace the evolution of these early sleeping practices, we begin to see the emergence of what might be called the first human architecture, not the grand structures of stone and metal that would come later, but the careful arrangement of fire, shelter, and sleeping bodies in configurations designed to maximize both safety and rest, to create conditions under which the profound vulnerability of sleep could be accepted without the constant fear that had plagued our ancestors since the dawn of consciousness. This represents perhaps the first example of humans actively shaping their environment to meet psychological as well as physical needs, recognizing that the mind required certain conditions for proper rest, just as much as the body required warmth and protection from the elements. Across the vast expanses of prehistoric Africa, as our ancestors began their first tentative steps toward the edges of the known world, sleep became not a destination but a temporary pause in an endless journey, a brief respite stolen from the demands of constant movement through landscapes that changed with each passing season, where the familiar sleeping places of one generation might be underwater, or buried beneath sand, or claimed by rival groups, by the time their descendants returned along the ancient migration routes that crisscrossed the continent, like invisible highways marked only in genetic memory, and the stories passed down through countless generations of wanderers. The archaeology of these movements reveals itself not in permanent structures, but in the ephemeral traces of temporary camps, in the patterns of stone tool distribution that suggest regular stops along predictable routes, in the evidence of sleeping arrangements that could be established quickly in unfamiliar territory, and abandoned just as quickly when the demands of survival required movement toward new hunting grounds or away from approaching dangers. Recent genetic studies have revealed that these early migrations were not random wanderings but carefully planned expeditions that required intimate knowledge of seasonal patterns, water sources, and the movement of animal herds across distances that would challenge even modern travelers equipped with maps and GPS technology, suggesting that the sleep patterns of our migrating ancestors were necessarily adapted to a lifestyle in which rest had to be compatible with constant alertness to changes in weather, terrain, and the proximity of both prey and predators. The evidence suggests that these early travelers developed sophisticated techniques for sleeping in unfamiliar environments, creating portable sleeping arrangements that could provide psychological as well as physical comfort in locations where every sound, every shadow, every shift in the wind might signal either opportunity or danger. Archaeological sites along ancient migration routes reveal evidence of sleeping areas that were established according to principles we can only partially understand. With careful attention paid to factors like drainage, wind direction, proximity to water sources, and sightlines that would allow sentries to maintain watch over the surrounding landscape while their companions rested, but also with attention to more subtle considerations that suggest our ancestors understood the psychological requirements of sleep in ways that went beyond mere physical security. The positioning of these temporary camps often demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of how landscape features could be used to create feelings of enclosure and safety even in completely open terrain, using natural windbreaks, elevated positions, and the acoustic properties of different geological formations to create sleeping environments that would maximize the quality of rest while minimizing vulnerability to surprise attack. Consider the profound trust required for sleep during these migrations, when the decision to close one's eyes meant placing absolute faith not only in the vigilance of companions, but in the group's collective ability to interpret the signs and sounds of unfamiliar territory, to distinguish between the normal sounds of an active ecosystem and the subtle variations that might indicate the approach of danger. The psychological demands of this lifestyle would have required forms of mental resilience and adaptability that are difficult for modern humans to comprehend. Living as we do in environments where sleep is associated with familiarity, routine, and the comfort of known surroundings, where the quality of our rest depends largely on our ability to exclude the outside world, rather than maintain constant awareness of our relationship to it. The evidence suggests that these migrating groups developed elaborate rituals around the establishment of temporary sleeping areas, ceremonies that served not only practical purposes in terms of organizing the camp and assigning responsibilities for night watch, but also psychological functions in terms of creating a sense of home and safety in places that were fundamentally alien and potentially hostile. These rituals might have included the careful inspection of the surrounding area for signs of previous human occupation, the ceremonial lighting of fires in specific patterns that would provide both practical illumination and spiritual protection, and the arrangement of sleeping bodies in configurations that reflected social hierarchies, while also optimizing the group's defensive capabilities, should they be attacked during the vulnerable hours of rest. Analysis of wear patterns on stone tools, and the distribution of artifacts around these ancient campsites, suggests that our migrating ancestors often prepared for sleep with the same meticulous attention to detail that modern travelers might devote to checking into a hotel, examining their weapons to ensure they were in proper condition, arranging their few possessions within easy reach, and positioning themselves within the group's sleeping arrangement according to their role in the community's defensive hierarchy. The archaeological record preserves evidence of this careful preparation in the form of tool caches placed at strategic locations around sleeping areas, in the patterns of wear on weapons that suggest they were kept ready for immediate use even during rest, and in the positioning of grinding stones and other processing tools that indicates food preparation continued well into the evening hours, as groups prepared for the uncertain rest that awaited them in unfamiliar territory. But perhaps most remarkably, the genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that these early migrants managed to maintain remarkably sophisticated knowledge systems that required forms of memory and cultural transmission that would have been impossible without high-quality sleep, suggesting that despite the challenges of their lifestyle, they found ways to achieve the kind of deep, restorative rest that modern sleep researchers recognize as essential for memory consolidation and learning. The fact that they were able to navigate across thousands of miles of unmarked terrain while maintaining complex tool technologies and social structures, indicates that their sleep, however different from ours in terms of duration and consistency, was successful in providing the cognitive restoration necessary for survival in environments that demanded constant adaptation and learning. As these migration patterns established themselves over thousands of generations, they created the first truly global human culture, a shared understanding of how to find rest and safety in unfamiliar environments, that would eventually enable our species to colonize every continent and adapt to every climate on Earth, carrying with them not just the practical knowledge of fire-making and tool creation, but the deeper wisdom of how to sleep well enough to dream, to remember, and to pass on to their children, the skills necessary for survival in a world that was always changing, always challenging them to find new ways of being human in places where no human had ever slept before. Deep within the limestone caverns of Europe and Asia, where darkness was not just the absence of light, but a living presence that pressed against the consciousness of early humans who had claimed these subterranean spaces as their first permanent homes, sleep took on qualities that were fundamentally different from the exposed vulnerability of sleeping under open skies, becoming something more akin to a return to the womb of the Earth itself, where the constant temperature and protection from weather created conditions for rest that were simultaneously more secure and more psychologically complex than anything our ancestors had previously experienced in their long journey from the African savannas to the limestone cliffs of Ice Age Europe. Archaeological investigations of sites like Atapuerca in Spain and the Dordogne caves of France reveal sleeping areas that were carefully prepared and maintained over multiple generations, with evidence of sophisticated floor preparations using animal skins, plant materials, and even carefully selected stones arranged to create sleeping surfaces that would provide comfort and warmth, while also facilitating drainage and air circulation in environments where humidity and cold could make the difference between restorative sleep and the kind of rest that left the sleeper more exhausted than when they first closed their eyes. The depth and complexity of these sleeping arrangements suggest that cave-dwelling humans invested considerable time and energy in creating optimal conditions for rest, understanding intuitively what modern sleep science has confirmed about the relationship between environmental factors and sleep quality. The psychological impact of sleeping deep underground, surrounded by stone walls that had witnessed thousands of years of geological time, would have been profound in ways that are difficult for surface-dwelling modern humans to fully appreciate, creating conditions in which the boundary between the dreaming mind and the ancient memory of the earth itself might have seemed permeable, where the echoes of footsteps and voices could carry for extraordinary distances through connected passages, creating an acoustic environment in which the sleeper was simultaneously isolated from the outside world and connected to the activities of the entire community in ways that would have influenced both the depth and content of their dreams. Recent studies of the acoustic properties of prehistoric cave sites have revealed that many of the areas chosen for human habitation possessed remarkable sound-conducting qualities that would have allowed sleeping individuals to remain subconsciously aware of activities throughout the cave system, creating a form of collective consciousness during rest that enabled the group to function as a single organism, even when individual members were unconscious, with sounds of danger or distress able to penetrate sleep and trigger immediate awakening, while normal activities could continue without disturbing those who were resting. This suggests that cave-dwelling humans developed sleep patterns that were exquisitely adapted to their unique environment, achieving forms of rest that were simultaneously deeper and more responsive than anything possible in exposed locations. The evidence from sites like Lascaux and Altamira indicates that the deepest sections of these cave systems, far from the entrance areas where daily activities took place, were reserved for the most profound forms of sleep, and possibly for activities that required complete isolation from the outside world, such as the vision quests and shamanic practices that may have played crucial roles in the spiritual life of these communities. The famous cave paintings found in these deep chambers might themselves be records of dreams or visionary experiences that occurred during extended periods of isolated sleep in the absolute darkness of the Earth's interior, suggesting that our ancestors understood the relationship between sensory deprivation and altered states of consciousness in ways that anticipate modern research into the effects of isolation on brain function and creativity. Analysis of the spatial organization of cave-dwelling sites reveals sophisticated understanding of how different areas within the cave system could be utilized for different types of rest, with evidence suggesting that sleeping arrangements were carefully organized according to factors like age, social status, and specific roles within the community, but also according to the particular qualities of different locations within the cave, with some areas apparently reserved for the kind of light, easily interrupted sleep that would be appropriate for sentries and new mothers, while other areas were designated for the deep, extended sleep that growing children and exhausted hunters required for proper recovery from the physical and psychological demands of survival in Ice Age environments. Perhaps most remarkably, the archaeological record suggests that these cave-dwelling communities developed elaborate bedtime rituals that served not only practical purposes in terms of security and comfort, but also spiritual functions related to their understanding of the relationship between sleep, death, and rebirth, with evidence of ceremonial arrangements of objects around sleeping areas that suggest they viewed each night's rest as a symbolic journey into the underworld, from which the sleeper had to be properly prepared and protected in order to ensure their safe return to waking consciousness. The discovery of carefully arranged animal bones, stone tools, and personal ornaments around sleeping areas in many cave sites suggests that our ancestors approached sleep with the same ritual seriousness that they brought to hunting, food preparation, and other essential survival activities. The unique challenges of cave sleeping would have included not only the obvious concerns about air quality and temperature regulation, but also the psychological adaptations required for rest in environments where the normal cycles of light and darkness were absent, where the passage of time could only be measured by internal biological rhythms and the activities of the community, creating conditions that might have led to sleep patterns that were fundamentally different from those of surface-dwelling humans, possibly including extended periods of rest punctuated by brief periods of activity, or the kind of segmented sleep patterns that some researchers believe were normal for pre-industrial humans, but which have been largely eliminated by artificial lighting and rigid work schedules in modern societies. During the grip of the last glacial period, when ice sheets stretched like white death across landscapes that had known warmth for millennia before the climate turned cold and harsh and unforgiving, sleep became not merely a biological necessity, but a strategy for survival that required our ancestors to fundamentally reimagine their relationship with consciousness itself, developing forms of rest that could conserve precious energy while maintaining the alertness necessary to respond to the constant threats posed by a world where temperatures could kill within hours, and food sources were so scarce that every calorie consumed during waking hours had to be carefully weighed against the energy requirements of staying warm through nights that seemed to stretch endlessly toward a dawn that might never come. Archaeological evidence from sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic and Malta in Siberia reveals that Ice Age humans developed sophisticated strategies for creating warm sleeping environments that went far beyond simply piling on animal skins, including the construction of semi-subterranean shelters that took advantage of the insulating properties of earth and snow, the development of communal sleeping arrangements that maximized shared body heat while maintaining social hierarchies and individual privacy, and the creation of heating systems that could maintain life-sustaining temperatures throughout the night, without requiring constant attention from wakeful guardians who might themselves succumb to cold if they remained motionless for too long in the sub-zero temperatures that characterized winter nights during the height of the glacial period. The psychological demands of sleeping in these conditions would have been extraordinary, requiring forms of mental discipline that allowed individuals to achieve the deep rest necessary for physical recovery, while remaining subconsciously alert to signs that their heating systems were failing, that dangerous changes in weather were approaching, or that the structural integrity of their shelters was being compromised by the weight of accumulating snow or the expansion and contraction of frozen ground. The quality of sleep achieved under these conditions would have been fundamentally different from modern sleep, characterized by a heightened sensitivity to environmental changes that would have made the difference between waking up refreshed and waking up dead from hypothermia or carbon monoxide poisoning from improperly ventilated heating fires. Recent studies of the physiological adaptations that enabled human survival during the Ice Age suggest that our ancestors may have developed the ability to enter states of reduced metabolic activity during sleep that approached the kind of controlled hibernation practiced by other cold-adapted mammals, allowing them to survive on minimal food resources while maintaining the cognitive function necessary for complex activities like tool manufacture, artistic creation, and the social cooperation that was essential for group survival in environments where individual humans were utterly dependent on their communities for continued existence. The evidence for this comes partly from the remarkable preservation of complex cultural practices during periods when archaeological evidence suggests that human populations were reduced to small, scattered groups struggling to survive in refugia scattered across the frozen landscape of Ice Age Europe and Asia. The dream life of Ice Age humans would have been profoundly shaped by the constant presence of cold, hunger, and the threat of death, creating sleep experiences in which the boundary between the physical reality of survival and the psychological landscape of fear, hope, and memory became fluid, in ways that may have contributed to the development of the complex spiritual beliefs and artistic traditions that characterize Upper Paleolithic culture. The famous cave paintings of this period might represent not just artistic expression, but records of dreams and visions that occurred during the extended periods of enforced inactivity that characterized winter months when travel was impossible, and most activities had to be suspended until the return of warmer weather made normal life possible once again. Evidence from sites like Sungir in Russia, where elaborate burials indicate sophisticated beliefs about death and the afterlife, suggests that Ice Age humans developed complex understanding of the relationship between sleep and death that went far beyond the simple recognition that both involved the cessation of normal waking consciousness, encompassing beliefs about the journey of the soul during sleep that paralleled their understanding of what happened to consciousness after death, creating religious and philosophical systems that treated nightly rest as a rehearsal for the ultimate transition that awaited every individual at the end of their earthly existence. The careful positioning of bodies in Ice Age burials, often arranged as if sleeping, suggests that these communities understood death as a form of sleep from which awakening was possible under certain circumstances, or in certain places that existed beyond the physical world. The technological innovations of the Ice Age, including the development of sewn clothing, sophisticated shelter construction techniques, and advanced hunting weapons, can be understood as responses not just to the practical challenges of survival in cold environments, but to the specific requirements of maintaining the quality of sleep necessary for the kind of cognitive function that made these innovations possible. In the first place, creating a feedback loop in which improved sleep led to better problem-solving ability, which led to improved survival strategies, which led to better sleep in an ascending spiral of adaptation that enabled human communities to not merely survive the Ice Age, but to emerge from it with enhanced capabilities and more complex social structures than had existed before the climate turned cold. Perhaps most remarkably, the genetic evidence suggests that the Ice Age population bottlenecks that reduced human numbers to perhaps as few as 10,000 individuals worldwide did not result in the loss of cultural complexity, but in its intensification, as small groups of survivors maintained and developed sophisticated knowledge systems that required high-quality sleep for memory consolidation and transmission, indicating that these Ice Age communities succeeded in creating sleeping conditions that supported not just physical survival, but the kind of cognitive function necessary for preserving and expanding the cultural achievements that would eventually enable the global expansion of human civilization when the ice sheets finally retreated and the world became warm enough once again to support larger populations and more complex social organizations. In the valleys of Europe, where Neanderthal families gathered around fires that cast dancing shadows on faces that were almost human but not quite, where children who would never know the world that was coming played with tools made by hands that were stronger than ours, but guided by minds that dreamed differently than we dream, sleep took on qualities that we can only imagine through the fragmentary evidence left behind in archaeological sites that preserve traces of lives lived fully and completely, in ways that challenge our assumptions about what it means to be human, what it means to rest, and what it means to find peace in a world that was already changing, in ways that would ultimately make no room for their particular way of being in the world. The archaeological record from sites like Shanidar Cave in Iraq and La Chapelle aux Saints in France reveals that Neanderthal sleeping arrangements were characterized by a level of social complexity and emotional sophistication that contradicts earlier assumptions about these close relatives of modern humans, with evidence suggesting that they cared for disabled community members who would have required assistance with basic activities, including finding comfortable positions for sleep, that they arranged sleeping areas to accommodate family groups that included multiple generations, and that they invested considerable effort in creating sleeping environments that provided not just physical comfort, but psychological security for individuals whose survival depended on maintaining close emotional bonds with their companions. Recent analysis of Neanderthal DNA, extracted from ancient bones, has revealed that these humans possessed the same genetic variants associated with normal sleep patterns in modern humans, suggesting that their sleep architecture was fundamentally similar to ours, in terms of the basic alternation between deep sleep and REM sleep, but the environmental and social conditions under which they experienced this sleep would have created forms of rest that were shaped by cultural practices and survival requirements that differed significantly from those of contemporary anatomically modern humans, who occupied some of the same European territories during the period when these two human lineages coexisted in an ice-bound landscape where resources were scarce and competition was fierce. The evidence suggests that Neanderthal communities developed elaborate bedtime rituals that included the careful banking of fires to ensure warmth throughout the night, the arrangement of sleeping skins and other materials to create comfortable sleeping surfaces, and the positioning of tools and weapons within easy reach of sleeping individuals in ways that indicate they faced many of the same nocturnal threats as other Ice Age humans, but responded to these challenges with solutions that reflected their particular physical capabilities and social structures. The robustness of Neanderthal skeletal architecture suggests that they were capable of surviving in conditions that would have been fatal to more lightly built modern humans, but this physical resilience would have been meaningless without the cultural knowledge necessary to create sleeping environments that took advantage of their physiological adaptations while compensating for their limitations. Perhaps most poignantly, the archaeological evidence from sites like Roc de Marseille in France suggests that Neanderthal parents took extraordinary care to ensure the comfort and safety of their sleeping children, creating sleeping areas that were positioned to take advantage of the warmest locations within their shelters, arranging bedding materials that would provide optimal insulation and comfort for growing bodies that required more sleep than adults, and maintaining vigilant watch over their offspring during the vulnerable hours of rest in ways that demonstrate the same parental devotion that characterizes modern human families, but which would have required even greater sacrifice given the harsh conditions under which these families struggled to survive. The discovery of Neanderthal burial sites that show evidence of deliberate arrangement of the body and inclusion of grave goods suggests that these humans possessed sophisticated beliefs about the relationship between sleep and death that influenced their sleeping practices in ways we can only partially reconstruct, but which seem to have included the understanding that proper rest required not just physical preparation but spiritual protection, that the journey into unconsciousness each night was analogous to the journey into death that awaited every individual, and that both transitions required careful preparation and the support of community members who understood the significance of these passages between different states of being. Analysis of wear patterns on Neanderthal teeth and the distribution of food remains around sleeping areas suggests that these humans often continued eating well into the evening hours, possibly as a strategy for maintaining body temperature during cold nights, but also possibly as a social activity that strengthened community bonds and provided psychological comfort before the group settled into sleep, creating bedtime routines that served multiple functions in terms of nutrition, social cohesion, and emotional preparation for the vulnerability of rest in environments where sleep was always a calculated risk that required the cooperation and vigilance of the entire group. The final disappearance of Neanderthal populations approximately 40,000 years ago represents not just the extinction of a human lineage, but the loss of particular ways of understanding and experiencing sleep that had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in response to specific environmental and social conditions, ways of rest that we can now only glimpse through the careful analysis of archaeological evidence that preserves traces of lives that were lived completely and meaningfully according to their own understanding of what it meant to be human, to find safety in community, and to trust in the possibility that morning would come again to those who managed to survive another night in a world that was beautiful and terrible, and ultimately unsustainable for their particular way of being alive. As we contemplate the sleep of the Neanderthals, we are confronted with questions about the nature of consciousness itself, about whether the dreams that visited them in their carefully prepared sleeping places were fundamentally different from our own dreams, whether their minds during rest processed the experiences of their daily lives according to patterns that we would recognize, or according to cognitive architectures that were uniquely their own, questions that ultimately challenge us to consider what aspects of our own sleep experience might be universal features of human consciousness, and what aspects might be particular to our specific evolutionary lineage, our specific cultural context, our specific moment in the long history of beings who close their eyes and trust in the possibility of awakening. Somewhere in the depths of human prehistory, in a moment that archaeological evidence can only approximate but never fully capture, sleep transformed from a purely biological necessity into something more profound and mysterious, becoming the foundation for humanity's first glimpses into realms that existed beyond the immediate and tangible, where the landscape of dreams became a territory to be explored with the same careful attention that our ancestors devoted to mapping the physical world around them, where the visions that came during rest began to be understood, not as random neural firing, but as messages, warnings, prophecies, and communications from sources that existed beyond the boundaries of ordinary waking consciousness, marking the emergence of symbolic thinking that would eventually give rise to art, religion, language, and all the other uniquely human ways of making meaning from the raw material of existence. The archaeological evidence for this transformation appears most clearly in the Upper Paleolithic period, roughly 45,000 years ago, when sites across Europe and Asia begin to show evidence of deliberate symbolic behavior that suggests our ancestors had developed sophisticated understanding of the relationship between sleep, dreams, and the spiritual dimensions of existence, with cave paintings that seem to depict not just the animals and landscapes of the waking world, but creatures and scenarios that could only have originated in the realm of dreams and visions, figures that combine human and animal characteristics in ways that suggest the artist was attempting to capture experiences that occurred during altered states of consciousness, that were accessible only through carefully cultivated forms of rest and meditation. Sites like Chauvet Cave in France and Sulawesi in Indonesia contain images that appear to represent not just artistic expression, but records of visionary experiences that may have been deliberately induced through techniques that combined sensory deprivation, extended periods of isolation in deep cave chambers, and possibly the use of naturally occurring psychoactive substances that would have enhanced the vividness and significance of dreams and visions experienced during carefully orchestrated sleeping sessions that served functions similar to the vision quests and shamanic practices documented in more recent hunter-gatherer societies around the world. The emergence of symbolic sleep practices would have required not just individual innovation, but cultural transmission systems that could preserve and pass on knowledge about how to achieve particular types of dreams, how to interpret the meanings of different kinds of visions, and how to integrate the insights gained during sleep into the practical decision-making processes that govern daily life, creating the first systematic approaches to what modern researchers call dream work, but which our ancestors would have understood as essential survival skills that provided access to information and guidance that was not available through ordinary waking consciousness. Recent studies of contemporary indigenous cultures that maintain traditional sleeping and dreaming practices suggest that the symbolic interpretation of dreams may have played crucial roles in prehistoric social organization, with certain individuals specializing in the cultivation of prophetic dreams that could provide guidance about weather patterns, animal migrations, the location of resources, and the intentions of neighboring groups, creating social roles that depended entirely on the ability to achieve specific types of rest, and to remember and interpret the visions that occurred during these carefully prepared sleeping sessions. The archaeological evidence for such specialization appears in the form of sleeping areas that were isolated from the general community and equipped with special arrangements of objects and symbols that suggest they were designed to facilitate particular types of visionary experience. The development of symbolic sleep practices would have had profound implications for the evolution of human consciousness itself, creating feedback loops between cultural innovation and cognitive development that enhanced our ancestors' ability to engage in abstract thinking, long-term planning, and complex social cooperation, capabilities that required forms of memory consolidation and creative problem-solving that could only occur during high-quality sleep, but which also depended on cultural frameworks that provided methods for interpreting and utilizing the insights that emerged from the unconscious mind during rest. This represents one of the first examples of human culture actively shaping human cognition in ways that enhanced our species' ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions and to develop increasingly sophisticated survival strategies. Analysis of the spatial organization of Upper Paleolithic cave sites reveals that areas designated for sleep were often positioned in locations with specific acoustic and visual properties that would have enhanced the intensity and memorability of dreams, suggesting that our ancestors understood principles of environmental psychology that modern sleep researchers are only beginning to rediscover, including the effects of complete darkness, natural sound resonance, and isolation from social stimulation on the content and significance of dream experiences. The deliberate selection and preparation of these sleeping environments indicates that symbolic sleep practices were not random individual experiences, but systematic cultural activities that required considerable knowledge and planning to execute effectively. Perhaps most significantly, the emergence of symbolic sleep practices appears to have coincided with the development of the first systematic burial practices, suggesting that our ancestors understood death as a form of sleep from which awakening might be possible under certain circumstances, a belief that would have profoundly influenced their approach to nightly rest as a rehearsal for the ultimate transition that awaited every individual, creating cultural practices around sleep that served not just practical functions in terms of physical rest, but spiritual functions in terms of preparing the soul for its eventual journey beyond the boundaries of physical existence. The careful positioning of bodies in Paleolithic burials, often arranged as if sleeping and surrounded by objects that might be needed in an afterlife, indicates that the symbolic understanding of sleep had become central to prehistoric beliefs about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to physical existence. As these symbolic sleep practices evolved and spread throughout human populations, they created the conceptual foundations for all subsequent human spiritual and philosophical traditions, establishing patterns of thought and practice that would eventually give rise to the complex religious systems, artistic traditions, and scientific methodologies that characterize human civilization, all of which can trace their origins back to those first moments when our ancestors closed their eyes and discovered that the landscape of dreams was not just a byproduct of rest, but a territory that could be explored, mapped, and utilized as a source of knowledge and insight that was essential for survival in a world that was far more complex and mysterious than it appeared to ordinary waking consciousness. As human consciousness evolved beyond the immediate demands of survival to encompass questions about meaning, purpose, and humanity's relationship to forces that seemed to govern the natural world from beyond the reach of ordinary understanding, sleep began to be understood not merely as a biological necessity or even as a gateway to prophetic dreams, but as a sacred activity that required proper preparation, appropriate locations, and ceremonial frameworks that could ensure the safety of the soul during its nightly journey through realms that were populated by spirits, ancestors, and other entities, whose intentions toward the living were not always benevolent, creating the first systematic approaches to what we might call sleep hygiene, but which our ancestors understood as essential spiritual practices that were as important for survival as food, water, and protection from the elements. Archaeological evidence from sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey and Newgrange in Ireland suggests that the construction of monumental sacred architecture was intimately connected with evolving understanding of sleep and its relationship to spiritual experience, with these massive stone structures designed not just for communal gatherings and ceremonial activities, but as sleeping places where individuals could experience contact with divine forces through carefully orchestrated dream experiences that were enhanced by the acoustic properties, astronomical alignments, and symbolic decorations of these sacred spaces, creating environments where the boundary between the material and spiritual worlds was understood to be more permeable than in ordinary locations. The evidence suggests that these sacred sleeping practices were not available to all members of prehistoric communities, but were reserved for individuals who had undergone specific training and initiation procedures that prepared them for the psychological and spiritual challenges of sleeping in places where the normal rules of reality were suspended, and where encounters with supernatural entities were not just possible but expected, creating specialized social roles that combined the functions of what we might now call sleep specialists, psychologists, and religious leaders, but which our ancestors would have understood as individuals who possessed the knowledge and courage necessary to serve as intermediaries between the world of the living and the various other worlds that could be accessed through properly prepared sleep experiences. Recent studies of the architectural features of prehistoric sacred sites have revealed sophisticated understanding of how environmental factors could be manipulated to enhance the quality and significance of sleep experiences, including the use of natural and artificial acoustics to create soundscapes that would influence dream content, the careful positioning of sleeping areas to take advantage of specific astronomical phenomena that were believed to enhance spiritual communication, and the incorporation of water features, air circulation systems, and other environmental controls that could create optimal conditions for the kind of deep, visionary sleep that was necessary for successful contact with spiritual entities and forces. The development of ritual sleep practices appears to have been closely connected with the emergence of agricultural societies, as communities that were no longer dependent on constant movement for survival had the resources and stability necessary to invest in the construction of permanent sacred sleeping sites and the training of specialized practitioners who could maintain the complex knowledge systems that governed the use of these facilities, creating the first institutional approaches to sleep and dreaming that established precedents for all subsequent religious and therapeutic traditions that recognize sleep as a gateway to healing, insight, and spiritual transformation. Analysis of artifact patterns around prehistoric sacred sleeping sites reveals evidence of elaborate preparation rituals that preceded sleep sessions, including purification practices that might have involved fasting, bathing, or the consumption of specific foods or substances that were believed to enhance spiritual receptivity, the arrangement of protective objects and symbols around sleeping areas to ensure safety during the vulnerable period of unconsciousness, and the performance of prayers, chants, or other ceremonial activities that were designed to attract the attention of beneficial spiritual entities while repelling those whose intentions were harmful or destructive. The psychological impact of sleeping in these sacred environments would have been profound, creating conditions in which the sleeper's expectations and cultural beliefs would have shaped dream content in ways that reinforced community values, provided guidance for important decisions, and maintained social cohesion through shared spiritual experiences that validated the group's understanding of their place in the cosmic order, but which also created opportunities for individual insight and transformation that could lead to innovations in technology, social organization, and spiritual understanding that benefited the entire community. Perhaps most importantly, the evidence suggests that these ritual sleep practices were not understood as separate from ordinary sleep, but as intensified versions of processes that occurred every night in every sleeping human being, creating cultural frameworks that treated all sleep as potentially sacred and all dreams as potentially meaningful, establishing attitudes toward rest and unconsciousness that recognized the profound vulnerability and extraordinary potential of the sleeping state in ways that influenced not just specialized spiritual practices, but everyday sleeping habits and domestic arrangements that reflected the understanding that proper rest required not just physical comfort but spiritual protection and cultural support. The decline of these prehistoric sacred sleeping traditions, as agricultural societies gave way to more complex civilizations, with different approaches to spiritual practice, and different understanding of the relationship between consciousness and the material world, represents not just a change in religious practice, but a fundamental transformation in humanity's relationship to sleep itself. moving away from understanding rest as a sacred activity that required communal support and ritual preparation toward more individualized approaches that emphasized privacy, personal comfort, and the exclusion of spiritual considerations from the practical business of getting adequate rest for the demands of increasingly complex economic and social systems. Yet traces of these ancient sacred sleeping practices persist in cultural traditions around the world, in the careful attention paid to the orientation and arrangement of sleeping spaces, according to principles that seem to echo prehistoric understanding of the relationship between sleep and spiritual well-being, in the survival of bedtime rituals that serve functions beyond mere preparation for rest, and in the continued recognition, even in our highly secularized modern world, that sleep is somehow more than just a biological process, that it remains a daily journey into mystery that connects us to aspects of existence that are not accessible to ordinary waking consciousness, preserving something of our ancestors' understanding, that rest is not just restoration but transformation, not just unconsciousness but a different kind of consciousness that remains essential for complete human flourishing. In the vast landscapes where human communities lived for the majority of our species' existence, where survival depended not on the accumulation of possessions or the construction of permanent shelters, but on intimate knowledge of seasonal patterns, animal behavior, and the subtle signs that indicated when and where resources could be found, sleep evolved into something far more complex and adaptive than the consolidated 8-hour blocks that modern humans have come to consider normal, developing instead into flexible, responsive patterns that could adjust to the demands of hunting expeditions that might last for days, gathering activities that required early morning starts to take advantage of optimal conditions, and social activities that continued well into the night, during times when resources were abundant and the community could afford to invest energy in the cultural practices that maintained group cohesion and transmitted essential knowledge to the next generation. Recent studies of contemporary hunter-gatherer societies that maintain traditional lifestyle patterns suggest that pre-agricultural humans likely experienced what researchers call polyphasic sleep, involving multiple periods of rest distributed throughout the 24-hour cycle, rather than the single extended period of nighttime sleep that characterizes modern urban life, with evidence indicating that this pattern was not a compromise forced by difficult conditions, but an optimal adaptation that allowed maximum flexibility in responding to environmental opportunities and challenges, while ensuring that all community members received adequate rest for the physical and cognitive demands of their subsistence activities. Archaeological evidence from sites like Starcar in England and Monte Verde in Chile reveals sleeping arrangements that were designed to accommodate these flexible rest patterns, with evidence of multiple sleeping areas within single sites that could be used by different individuals at different times, depending on their roles in current subsistence activities, their position in the community's social hierarchy, and their individual sleep requirements, suggesting that hunter-gatherer communities developed sophisticated understanding of sleep as an individual as well as collective need that required careful coordination to ensure that essential activities like food processing, tool maintenance, and protection from predators could continue around the clock when circumstances required continuous activity. The evidence suggests that hunter-gatherer sleep patterns were intimately connected with lunar cycles, seasonal changes, and the behavior patterns of the animals and plants that formed the basis of their subsistence systems, creating forms of rest that were synchronized not just with the daily alternation of light and darkness, but with longer-term environmental rhythms that influenced when certain activities were most likely to be successful, when travel was safest, and when social gatherings were most appropriate, indicating that our ancestors understood sleep not as a withdrawal from environmental engagement, but as a way of maintaining optimal responsiveness to the complex, ever-changing conditions that determined survival success in pre-agricultural environments. Analysis of skeletal remains from hunter-gatherer sites reveals evidence of physical adaptations that supported these flexible sleep patterns, including bone density patterns that suggest regular periods of reduced activity, alternating with periods of intense physical exertion, joint wear patterns that indicate a lifestyle involving considerable variety in daily activities rather than repetitive specialized tasks, and dental evidence that suggests dietary patterns involving periods of abundance alternating with periods of scarcity, all of which would have required sleep patterns that could support rapid recovery from physical stress, while maintaining the cognitive flexibility necessary for constant adaptation to changing circumstances. The social dimensions of hunter-gatherer sleep were particularly complex, involving elaborate systems of reciprocal responsibility that ensured community safety, while allowing individual members to achieve the rest they needed for optimal function. with evidence suggesting that sleep scheduling was coordinated according to principles that took into account not just immediate security needs, but long-term planning for upcoming subsistence activities, social obligations, and seasonal transitions that required advanced preparation and careful timing to execute successfully. These coordination systems would have required sophisticated communication and decision-making processes that demonstrate the high level of social organization that characterized even relatively small hunter-gatherer groups. Perhaps most remarkably, the evidence suggests that hunter-gatherer communities developed detailed knowledge about individual sleep requirements and patterns, recognizing that different people needed different amounts and types of rest depending on their age, physical condition, social role, and individual constitution, creating personalized approaches to sleep that were far more sophisticated than the one-size-fits-all recommendations that characterize modern sleep medicine, with evidence indicating that community members who served as healers and knowledge keepers possessed detailed understanding of how sleep problems could be diagnosed and treated, using environmental modifications, herbal remedies, and social interventions that addressed both the immediate symptoms and underlying causes of rest difficulties. The transition from hunter-gatherer sleep patterns to the more rigid schedules required by agricultural and industrial societies represents one of the most significant changes in human life patterns in our species' history, involving not just modifications in when and how people sleep, but fundamental alterations in the relationship between individual biological rhythms and social organization, between personal autonomy and collective coordination, and between human activity patterns and natural environmental cycles, changes that may have contributed to many of the sleep problems that plague modern societies, and which suggest that our ancestors' flexible, environmentally responsive approach to rest may have been more conducive to both individual health and social functioning than the consolidated sleep patterns that we now consider normal. As we consider the sleep patterns of our hunter-gatherer ancestors, we are confronted with questions about what we may have lost in our journey towards civilization, about whether the security and comfort of modern sleeping arrangements compensate for the loss of the deep environmental connection and social integration that characterized prehistoric rest patterns, and about whether it might be possible to recapture some of the adaptive flexibility and responsiveness that enabled our ancestors to find restorative rest under conditions that would challenge even the most experienced modern outdoors enthusiasts. Questions that become increasingly relevant as modern sleep research reveals the extent to which contemporary sleep problems may be related to the disconnection from natural rhythms and social support systems that our ancestors took for granted as essential elements of healthy, sustainable approaches to rest and recovery. In the flickering firelight of prehistoric gatherings where the day's experiences were transformed into stories that would outlive the tellers, where the boundary between memory and imagination became fluid under the influence of exhaustion, community bonding, and the hypnotic rhythm of voices carrying ancient wisdom into the receptive minds of listeners, whose consciousness was already beginning to drift towards sleep, the strange and often terrifying experiences of rest began to be woven into narratives that sought to explain not just what happened when human beings closed their eyes, but why sleep was necessary, what forces governed the landscape of dreams, and how the nightly journey into unconsciousness related to the larger mysteries of birth, death, and humanity's place in a cosmos that seemed to operate according to principles that were only partially comprehensible to waking rational thought. Archaeological evidence from sites around the world suggests that the development of complex mythological systems was intimately connected with evolving understanding of sleep and its relationship to other altered states of consciousness, with cave paintings, carved figurines, and other symbolic artifacts that appear to represent not just artistic expression, but systematic attempts to record and transmit knowledge about the spiritual dimensions of sleep that could not be communicated through ordinary language, but required symbolic representation that could capture the paradoxical, transformative, and often contradictory nature of experiences that occurred during rest, and which seemed to provide access to information and insights that were not available through normal waking consciousness. The earliest sleep myths appear to have been concerned primarily with explaining the vulnerability that accompanied rest, and with providing cultural frameworks that could help community members understand and cope with the fear, confusion, and disorientation that could result from vivid dreams, sleep paralysis, nightmares, and other sleep-related phenomena that seemed to suggest that consciousness during rest was subject to influences and interventions from sources that existed beyond the ordinary material world, creating the first systematic attempts to map the territory of sleep and to develop practical guidance for navigating its challenges safely and beneficially. Analysis of recurring motifs in sleep-related myths from cultures around the world reveals common themes that suggest our ancestors shared similar understanding of the basic features of sleep experience, including the belief that the soul or consciousness could separate from the physical body during rest and travel to other locations or dimensions, the understanding that dreams could provide prophetic information about future events or guidance for current challenges, and the recognition that sleep made individuals vulnerable to spiritual attack or possession by entities whose intentions were not aligned with human welfare, creating mythological systems that served both explanatory and protective functions in relation to the nightly experience of unconsciousness. The development of these mythological frameworks appears to have been closely connected with the emergence of specialized social roles for individuals who possessed particular expertise in sleep-related matters, including healers who could diagnose and treat sleep disorders, interpreters who could explain the meanings of significant dreams, and spiritual practitioners who could provide protection against the dangers that were believed to threaten sleeping individuals, creating the first professional approaches to sleep medicine that combined practical knowledge about environmental factors that influenced rest quality with sophisticated understanding of the psychological and spiritual dimensions of sleep experience. Recent studies of contemporary cultures that maintain traditional mythological understanding of sleep suggest that these ancient narrative frameworks served important psychological functions that went beyond simple explanation of mysterious phenomena, providing community members with conceptual tools that could help them integrate difficult or traumatic sleep experiences into their overall understanding of themselves and their place in the world, creating meaning-making systems that could transform potentially destabilizing encounters with the unknown dimensions of consciousness into opportunities for personal growth, spiritual development, and enhanced understanding of the complexity and mystery of human existence. The evidence suggests that prehistoric sleep myths were not static belief systems but dynamic, evolving frameworks that could incorporate new experiences and insights while maintaining continuity with established cultural wisdom, creating traditions of sleep-related storytelling that served educational functions in terms of transmitting practical knowledge about rest and recovery, while also providing entertainment that could strengthen community bonds and create shared cultural identity through the collective exploration of themes that were relevant to every community member's nightly experience of vulnerability and transformation. Perhaps most significantly, the development of sleep myths appears to have been instrumental in the evolution of human language and narrative capability, providing contexts in which community members could practice describing experiences that were difficult to capture in ordinary descriptive language, developing vocabulary and storytelling techniques that could communicate the subjective, emotional, and spiritual dimensions of sleep experience, while also preserving practical information about optimal sleeping conditions, effective treatments for sleep problems, and social protocols that could ensure community safety during the vulnerable hours of rest. The decline of traditional sleep mythologies in modern societies, as scientific understanding of sleep physiology has replaced spiritual explanations of sleep phenomena, represents not just a change in belief systems but a loss of cultural resources that once provided meaning, comfort, and practical guidance for dealing with the challenges and mysteries of rest, leaving many contemporary individuals without adequate conceptual frameworks for understanding and integrating their own sleep experiences, particularly those aspects of rest that seem to transcend purely biological explanations, and which continue to suggest that sleep involves encounters with dimensions of existence that are not fully captured by materialistic approaches to consciousness and human experience. Yet elements of these ancient sleep mythologies persist in modern cultural expressions, in the continuing fascination with dreams and their potential meanings, in the survival of bedtime stories and lullabies that serve functions similar to prehistoric sleep narratives, and in the recognition that sleep remains one of the most mysterious and significant aspects of human experience, continuing to generate questions and insights that challenge our understanding of consciousness, reality, and the relationship between individual experience and larger cosmic patterns, preserving something of our ancestors' understanding that rest is not just a biological process, but a daily encounter with mystery that requires both practical preparation and spiritual wisdom to navigate successfully. In the intimate spaces where prehistoric families and communities gathered for rest, where individual vulnerability was transformed into collective security through the simple yet profound act of sleeping within reach of others who shared the same risks and the same hopes for morning's return, the practice of communal sleep created bonds that went far deeper than mere convenience or protection, establishing patterns of trust, interdependence, and emotional intimacy that formed the foundation for all subsequent human social organization, where the willingness to close one's eyes in the presence of others represented perhaps the ultimate expression of faith in community solidarity, and where the responsibility for maintaining watch over sleeping companions created reciprocal obligations that bound groups together with ties that were stronger than kinship, more reliable than formal agreements, and more enduring than any individual's lifetime. Archaeological evidence from sites across the globe reveals sleeping arrangements that were carefully designed to balance individual comfort with collective security, with evidence suggesting that prehistoric communities developed sophisticated understanding of how sleeping positions, spatial arrangements, and group composition could influence both the quality of individual rest and the effectiveness of community defense systems, creating sleeping configurations that took into account factors like age, physical condition, social status, and specialized roles within the group, while also ensuring that all community members could achieve the rest they needed for optimal function in their daily survival activities. The psychological implications of communal sleep would have been profound, creating conditions in which individual identity was constantly reinforced through physical proximity to other community members, where personal security was understood to be inseparable from group welfare, and where the most private and vulnerable aspects of human experience were shared within frameworks of mutual responsibility and care that created emotional bonds of extraordinary intensity and durability, establishing social relationships that were characterized by levels of intimacy and interdependence that are difficult for modern individuals to comprehend, given our cultural emphasis on privacy, autonomy, and individual achievement. Recent studies of contemporary cultures that maintain traditional communal sleeping practices suggest that shared rest creates opportunities for social learning and cultural transmission that are not available in individualized sleeping arrangements, with evidence indicating that children who sleep in close proximity to adults and older siblings acquire social skills, emotional regulation capabilities, and cultural knowledge through unconscious absorption of patterns of breathing, movement, and response that occur during rest, creating educational processes that operate below the level of conscious awareness, but which may be more effective than formal instruction in transmitting the subtle social competencies that are essential for successful community membership. The evidence suggests that communal sleep served important functions in conflict resolution and social harmony, providing opportunities for community members who had experienced tension or disagreement during waking hours to re-establish positive relationships through the sharing of vulnerable space and mutual care during rest, creating natural mechanisms for maintaining group cohesion that prevented minor disputes from escalating into divisions that could threaten community survival, while also providing contexts in which social hierarchies could be negotiated and maintained through subtle protocols around sleeping arrangements that reinforced status relationships without requiring explicit confrontation or formal enforcement. Analysis of sleeping area arrangements in prehistoric sites reveals evidence of elaborate social protocols that governed communal rest, including rules about who could sleep where, in what positions, and in proximity to which other community members, suggesting that our ancestors understood sleep not as a withdrawal from social engagement, but as a continuation of community life under different conditions that required different forms of awareness, cooperation, and mutual support, creating social systems that remained active and responsive even when individual community members were unconscious, and therefore unable to participate in ordinary forms of communication and decision-making. Perhaps most remarkably, the archaeological evidence suggests that communal sleeping arrangements were not simply practical responses to security needs, but were actively cultivated as essential elements of community identity and social organization, with evidence indicating that groups invested considerable effort in creating sleeping environments that could accommodate changing group composition, seasonal variations in community size, and the special needs of different categories of community members, demonstrating that the quality of shared rest was understood to be crucial for maintaining the social bonds that made survival possible in environments where individual humans were utterly dependent on group cooperation for continued existence. The transition from communal to individual sleeping arrangements that accompanied the development of agricultural societies and later industrial civilization represents one of the most significant changes in human social organization in our species' history, involving not just modifications in sleeping practices, but fundamental alterations in the nature of social relationships, the development of individual identity, and the balance between personal autonomy and community solidarity, changes that may have contributed to many of the social problems that characterize modern societies, and which suggest that our ancestors' communal approach to rest may have provided forms of social support and emotional security that are difficult to replace through other means. The health implications of this transition are only beginning to be understood, with emerging research suggesting that the isolation and individualization that characterize modern sleeping practices may contribute to increased rates of anxiety, depression, and other mental health problems that were less common in societies where rest was understood as a shared activity that reinforced social bonds and provided opportunities for mutual care and support, indicating that our ancestors' understanding of sleep as a communal rather than individual activity may have provided psychological and emotional benefits that we are only now beginning to recognize and appreciate. As we consider the communal sleep practices of our ancestors, we are confronted with questions about what we may have gained and lost in our journey toward privacy and individual autonomy, about whether the security and comfort of sleeping alone compensate for the loss of the deep social connection and emotional support that characterized prehistoric rest patterns, and about whether it might be possible to recapture some of the benefits of shared sleep without sacrificing the individual freedom and personal space that modern humans have come to value as essential elements of psychological well-being. Questions that become increasingly relevant as social isolation and loneliness emerge as significant public health challenges in societies that have prioritized individual achievement over community solidarity. In the vast darkness that surrounded every human settlement before the invention of electric lighting, where the sounds of night carried messages of both opportunity and danger, across landscapes that were shared with creatures whose senses were far superior to human capabilities, and whose hunting strategies had been perfected over millions of years of evolution, sleep represented not just vulnerability but a calculated risk that required our ancestors to develop strategies that could provide rest while minimizing the chances of becoming prey to the large carnivores, venomous snakes, and other predators that used the cover of darkness to hunt the unwary, creating elaborate systems of protection, early warning, and rapid response that transformed the simple act of closing one's eyes into a complex choreography of survival that involved every member of the community in an intricate dance of vigilance, trust, and mutual dependency. Archaeological evidence from sites like Atapuerca in Spain and Zhoukoudian in China reveals sleeping arrangements that were clearly designed with predator defense as a primary consideration, with evidence of carefully constructed barriers, strategic positioning of sleeping areas in locations that would be difficult for large animals to approach undetected, and the systematic placement of weapons and tools within easy reach of sleeping individuals, suggesting that our ancestors possessed detailed knowledge of predator behavior, hunting patterns that enabled them to create sleeping environments that could provide both physical protection and the psychological security necessary for achieving the deep rest that was essential for survival in environments where a single night of inadequate sleep could mean the difference between life and death the following day. The evidence suggests that prehistoric communities developed sophisticated early warning systems that could detect the approach of predators while allowing community members to achieve necessary rest, including the use of domesticated animals whose superior senses could provide advance notice of approaching danger, the arrangement of noise-making devices that would be disturbed by the movement of intruders, and the cultivation of heightened sensitivity to environmental changes that could indicate the presence of threats even during sleep, creating multi-layered defense systems that operated continuously throughout the night without requiring conscious attention from sleeping humans, but which could trigger immediate awakening and coordinated response when circumstances required active defensive measures. Recent studies of predator-prey relationships in contemporary ecosystems have revealed that large carnivores possess remarkable abilities to detect and exploit vulnerability in potential prey species, suggesting that our ancestors faced predators that were capable of recognizing when human communities were sleeping and of timing their attacks to take advantage of reduced alertness and slower response times, creating evolutionary pressure that favored the development of sleeping practices that could minimize detectability while maintaining the ability to respond rapidly to threats, including techniques for achieving rest while remaining partially alert to environmental changes, and for transitioning quickly from sleep to full defensive readiness when danger was detected. The psychological impact of sleeping under constant threat of predation would have been profound, requiring forms of mental conditioning that allowed individuals to achieve restorative rest, despite the knowledge that their survival depended on factors that were largely beyond their direct control, creating adaptive responses that may have included the ability to sleep lightly while still obtaining necessary physiological recovery, the development of heightened dream activity that processed fears and rehearsed emergency responses, and the cultivation of trust relationships with community members that were strong enough to allow individuals to surrender consciousness while relying on others for protection during their most vulnerable hours. Analysis of bone deposits and tool wear patterns at prehistoric sites provides evidence of successful and unsuccessful encounters with nocturnal predators, including remains that suggest some sleeping humans fell victim to large carnivores, despite the protective measures employed by their communities, but also evidence of successful defense against predator attacks that indicates our ancestors were capable of mounting effective resistance even when surprised during rest, suggesting that prehistoric sleeping arrangements were not just passive defensive measures, but active systems that could transform sleeping communities into coordinated defensive units capable of repelling threats that would have been fatal to isolated individuals. The development of fire as a predator deterrent represents one of humanity's most significant technological achievements, not just because it provided light and warmth, but because it created the first artificial environment in which human communities could achieve truly deep sleep without constant fear of predation, transforming night from a period of maximum vulnerability into a time when human settlements became islands of safety and landscapes that remained dangerous for all other creatures, marking the beginning of humanity's gradual conquest of the night, and our eventual dominance over the natural systems that had previously constrained our activities to daylight hours. Perhaps most importantly, the challenges of sleeping safely in the presence of predators appear to have been instrumental in the development of the social cooperation and communication systems that became characteristic of human communities, creating circumstances that rewarded groups that could coordinate their defensive activities, share information about threats, and maintain collective vigilance while allowing individual members to achieve necessary rest, establishing patterns of reciprocal responsibility and mutual aid that formed the foundation for all subsequent human social organization, and which may have been crucial factors in our species' eventual success in colonizing environments around the world. The gradual elimination of large predators from most human-inhabited areas represents one of the most significant changes in the conditions of human existence since the development of agriculture, removing selective pressures that had shaped human sleeping behavior for hundreds of thousands of years, and creating conditions in which rest could be pursued primarily for restoration and comfort, rather than as a carefully calculated survival strategy, changes that may have contributed to the sleep problems that characterize modern societies, where the biological and psychological adaptations that once enabled safe sleep in dangerous environments may no longer be necessary, but continue to influence our rest patterns in ways that can interfere with optimal sleep quality. As we consider our ancestors' relationship with nocturnal predators, we are reminded of the extent to which human civilization has transformed the basic conditions of existence, creating environments in which sleep has become so safe and routine that we sometimes forget the profound courage and ingenuity that were required for our species to achieve rest and recovery, in a world where closing one's eyes meant accepting risks that could be fatal, where every night's sleep was a gamble with death, that was won through careful planning, social cooperation, and the kind of trust in community solidarity that enabled individuals to surrender consciousness while relying on others to maintain the vigilance that kept everyone alive until morning. In the deepest hours of prehistoric nights, when consciousness released its grip on the immediate demands of survival and drifted into realms where the ordinary rules of physics and logic no longer applied, where memories combined with fears and hopes to create narratives that seemed more real than waking experience, the human mind began to explore territories that existed nowhere else in the natural world, developing capabilities for symbolic thinking, creative problem-solving, and abstract reasoning that would eventually distinguish our species from all other forms of life on Earth, as dreams became not just random neural activity, but a laboratory for consciousness, where new ideas could be tested, traumatic experiences could be processed, and the accumulated wisdom of daily life could be reorganized into patterns that enhance survival, creativity, and social cooperation in ways that would prove essential for the development of language, art, technology, and all the other achievements that characterize human civilization. Archaeological evidence suggests that the evolution of complex dream consciousness coincided with the emergence of symbolic behavior in the archaeological record, appearing at roughly the same time as cave paintings, carved figurines, burial practices, and other indicators of abstract thinking that suggest our ancestors had developed the ability to manipulate concepts that existed beyond immediate sensory experience, creating mental models of reality that could be modified, recombined, and used to generate novel solutions to survival challenges, capabilities that may have been initially developed and refined during dream states before being applied to waking activities, indicating that the evolution of human consciousness may have been fundamentally dependent on the unique cognitive possibilities that emerged during sleep. Recent neuroscientific research has revealed that the brain activity patterns associated with dreaming are remarkably similar to those observed during creative problem-solving and insight generation in waking consciousness, suggesting that the mental processes that occur during REM sleep may have played crucial roles in the development of human cognitive capabilities that depend on the ability to see connections between apparently unrelated phenomena, to generate novel combinations of existing knowledge, and to envision possibilities that do not currently exist in the material world, abilities that would have been essential for the technological and social innovations that enabled human communities to adapt to changing environmental conditions and to develop increasingly sophisticated survival strategies. The content of prehistoric dreams would have been profoundly shaped by the daily experiences of survival in dangerous environments, creating sleep narratives that processed encounters with predators, rehearsed hunting strategies, explored social relationships, and integrated new environmental information with existing knowledge in ways that enhanced the dreamer's ability to respond effectively to similar situations in waking life. But the evidence suggests that dream consciousness also provided opportunities for experiences that transcended immediate survival concerns, creating mental spaces where individuals could explore questions about meaning, purpose, and humanity's relationship to the larger cosmos that surrounds and encompasses all earthly existence.